Yeah, what about you? Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great.
Nice.
Yay. Hello.
Hey, Fabian, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm a bit tired, but I'm good.
Yeah.
Can we go ahead?
Yeah, sure.
So this, I think, is going to be exciting. If for those who are not familiar with us, the four of us, we're all living in London, and we do a lot of moon photography in London when the weather allows, which is not like often. And so, because we are, this is the third and last supermoon of the year, everybody asks us, are those photos like with the moon in Tower Bridge like fake, this and that? They were like, no, it's real. So I think it's finally like, we give like a clubhouse talk on this and start explaining how you can get those shots as well. So happy solstice, is the longest I know, it's a fun astronomical event, but today we're not going to be talking about the sun, but about the moon. And so can we first like introduce ourselves? What do we do about our photography? And most importantly, what got you interested in the moon? George, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. So my name is George, and I am a photographer from London, as Mara explained. So I go by on social media like GGTS photography. I've been into photography for 5 years now. It all started with me wanting to record instructional videos for guitar. I play guitar for a living. So this is how I got interested into photography. I got about 3 cameras, and then in a year and a half, I realized that I got hooked up completely in photography. And actually, one of the first photos that I ever took, it was the moon, because I found it fascinating. And after a few years and spending thousands of pounds, I ended up getting a master's in photography from the Institute of Photography. I won a Samyang competition. I came first place in 2018 and second place in 2019. I won the best photographer of the year in 2019 as well on kelby1.com. And ever since, I just shoot mainly landscape, cityscapes, some portraits, live concerts, which unfortunately are not happening at the moment. And what got me fascinated into the moon is like I always wanted to see the details of the craters of the moon. So I went into a journey trying to find like the longest focal length that I could ever get on a DSLR at the time. And now on mirrorless, I'm shooting with the R5, and my current setup is an R5 with a 2x extender and RF 100 to 500. And with my fellow photographers, the speakers, we just go hunting moonrises and moonsets most of the time, especially with the supermoon. We had some success and a lot of downfalls because of the weather. But yeah, that's me. So I think I can pass the torch over to either Priya or Fabian.
So my name is Fabien, and the strange accent comes from me being half Italian, half French, but I'm based in London like the other speakers. And I am a full-time professional photographer, mainly doing fine art photography. And I got into photography more than 20 years ago as a complement of my design job. I was a creative director for more than 25 years until I got completely burned out by the job and decided to leave, went on a sabbatical for a year, traveling around the world, and then decided to come back to London as a photographer. And in these past, 3 years now, I photographed pretty much anything and everything. I was exhibited twice last year in a Photographer of the Year exhibition, once for Nature, once overall Photographer of the Year. And I think next week I'll be exhibited in Denmark, in Copenhagen, at the Travel Photographer of the Year exhibition as well. And what got me into moon photography? To be honest, I'm not really that much interested into the moon. It's more about the process. What I really like in everything that I photograph, whether it's a sunset, a sunrise, a moonrise, whatever, it's the planning. So it's all the, like when I go out somewhere on an adventure, it's the journey what matters to me more than the destination, right? So more than shooting the moon, what I really like is all the planning, all the excitement, going scouting a place for 8 hours and then go there back to shoot the moon. So yeah, that's me.
Hi, hi everyone. I'm Priya. I go by the name Journey Seven Continents on social media, and I first picked up a camera about 5 years ago after a trip to Iceland, which is what really got me into photography. And I wanted to be able to capture the Milky Way because we were going stargazing in South America, and that's kind of where my journey began. But generally, I like night skies, moon, all sorts of night photography. So yeah, the moon is kind of just part of that, I guess. And under normal circumstances, I probably would call myself a travel photographer. That's what I've mainly done over the last few years until COVID came about and we haven't been able to travel. So now I have the opportunity to do a lot more in London, which is nice. Finally, after all these years of living in London, I'm actually taking photos here. If the weather improves, I'll be able to get a few more shots of the moon. But yeah, let's see.
That's awesome. So great to have you guys here. So I'm Mara. I'm also a landscape and astrophotographer. I tend to like living in big cities, so I do a lot of cityscape. My other job is I'm currently a PhD student. I do space science. And so I have this fascination about space. And because I live in big cities and I cannot see the Milky Way and other astros at night, I really like the moon, and I try to hunt the moon whenever the weather allows me, because it's what I get, close to, in the cities. So I think we have a nice program for you tonight. And I know that some people that are here is the first time they've never shot the moon before. And so we're going to go over to some gear, some beginner's gear, to some basic settings. We're going to talk a little bit about less compression. That's the term or the technique we use to get those really, really big moons. Because everybody asks us, oh, we didn't see that. We're like, our cameras did. And so, but basically, what you're going to learn today, how to shoot a super moon, is actually what you can use every month to shoot a full moon, because the supermoon is just a full moon that is closest to the Earth on its elliptic orbit. And so it usually looks 70% larger than the regular full moon. So everything that you're going to learn today, you can apply to every full moon for the rest of the year. Should we start talking about just basic settings and and basic gear? So I always tell people, if you want to shoot the moon, one of the first things that you need to buy is a long lens, preferably more than 200 millimeters. Does anybody agree? Do they have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with my experience, because I started shooting the moon from 200 millimeters, and now I can shoot actually all the way up to 1600 millimeters with some tricks. What I found when I was really looking into it is that when you try to shoot the moon against a subject, which could be a building or a monument or anything, you need to calculate the distance in order to tell how many millimeters you want. Pardon me. So the things are, for a beginner, if you want to shoot the moon, it doesn't really matter what gear you have, as long as you have. I believe everybody has like a telephoto zoom lens, like a 75 to 300 or something, and you can still take pretty decent shots of the moon with that. So anything I would recommend from 300 millimeters and higher will give you a good result. Understanding, again, as Mara said, the lens compression, which is how large the moon is going to be against your subject and how far is the distance in between you and your subject, will play a role in how many millimeters you have. But generally speaking, if I want to give like a couple of tips for a beginner, if the moon is not really high up in the sky, try to underexpose a bit in order to get a good shot of the details of the moon. Underexposing by maximum one stop will give you some good results. Try to use a tripod. Be on a tripod. Your shutter speed shouldn't be too slow, nothing below 1/5 or 1/6 of a second. That should hopefully give you a clear moonshot, because obviously the moon moves, so you don't want to get blurry effect on it. And if the moon is really high up in the sky and it's dark, try to underexpose by 3. It depends on the camera and the brand and the dynamic range of your camera. Try to underexpose between 3 and 4 stops. Shoot at f11 and ISO the lowest possible. If you can shoot on 100, that's great, in order to get a clean, sharp photo of the moon and preserve all details and not burn out everything but the highlights that your camera sees. And I can pass over to maybe Priya or Fabian.
Hi. Yeah, I guess maybe just for the benefit of others, it might be worth explaining a bit more why we underexpose the moon by 3 or 4 stops and why you would use f11. I know you kind of said it already, just to sort of maintain the details, right? So at f11, you're more likely to be able to get a sharper shot of everything. And by underexposing, again, you can get the details of those craters. Otherwise, you'll just get a big white ball, as opposed to getting the details of the moon in there. So that's why you'd use the settings that George mentioned.
Yeah, that's correct. And apart from that, I think understanding how your camera works, because obviously if you have a micro thirds or a APS-C camera or a full frame, usually they perceive light in a different way because of the size of the sensor. So shooting at f11 should give you enough to get the mood, sharp and in focus. Sometimes you have to shoot at f13. Sometimes it might be f14. For example, my setup is my widest aperture when I'm on 1000 millimeters or 1600 is f14. Which, funnily enough, I found that if I shoot the moon with the current setup, if I shoot it at f18, I get a lot sharper photo rather with the f14. And I think it's important to do a couple of tests before you go to shoot the full moon. And it's really, the best days to do it is actually 2 or 3 days before the full moon, because when it's the full moon, it's really hard to preserve all the details on the craters and everything. So 2 or 3 days before, you get a shot that can actually bring up more details on the craters.
Now, my answer to this will be a lot more complicated, and so I will confuse everyone. Because actually, I don't care that much about the aperture, and at least when I shoot from far away, because what the aperture really sets is the depth of field. And if you shoot, for example, like in one of my last tries, when I was with George, actually, I was 16 miles away from London. So even shooting an f2.8 would have given me enough sharpness in the city, because the depth of field of all the skyscrapers there is absolutely negligible. And so it really depends on where you are, what you want to shoot, and the distance, and how bright is the moon. And so it is a little more complicated than that. But f11 is a good starting point, because usually it's one of the sweet spots of every lens between f8 and f11. But but George mentioned Micro Four Third. If you shoot on Micro Four Third or APS-C mirrorless cameras, the crop sensor also affects the aperture. So f11 on a full frame would actually be f8 on a mirrorless camera, or less on a Micro Four Third. So it really depends. I mean, if you have live view, or if you have any preview when you shoot, so you can see on screen what you're doing, try to adjust for the brightness of the moon and then tweak the settings afterwards. I think that would be my advice.
Yeah. I agree. I've also shot before with like, F6 or F8, and I was able to. It was pretty sharp. Also, you can also, if you're shooting raw, it can also increase the sharpness in post processing. It really depends on like I think it was Georgia was saying that it's always good to try to photograph the moon before the official full moon, because then the sky is a little too dark when the moon rises. So these settings will depend, which day are you taking, are you photographing the moon. If it's actually on the full moon day and the day after, then the sky will be dark, and you really need to worry about the contrast, because the moon is super super bright against and it can be easily overexposed, while like the days before it's a less contrast between the sky and the moon. But yeah, so but for good starters, I think, yeah, if someone is here and is new and is trying to shoot the moon, I think good starters, yeah, a long lens, with 200 millimeters, like I think as Fabio or Jordan say, there's a really cheap lens that's 70 to 300 that can get you good results. And then start with, f11 ISO 100 and try to aim for like starters before the day or 2 days before the actual full moon, so you have enough light coming in.
Also, we haven't spoken. We spoke about aperture and ISO, but we should probably speak about shutter speed, right? And that you need if you're using long lenses, you want your shutter speed to be ideally at least 2 times your focal length. And so that probably might play into what settings you need to use to make sure you get a sharp shot.
Yeah, you are absolutely correct. Now I think you can get away with going even just 1 over a length of your lens. So if you're shooting 400 millimeters, you can shoot at 1 at 400th of a second. But yeah, considering that also the moon moves quite fast, you need to take into account shutter speed as well.
And also the shake, right? If it's windy, even if it's on a tripod with a long lens, you'll get a bit of a shake. So it's keeping in mind that you might get that sort of blur from both the tripod and also the moon moving.
Yeah, I think, from my experience, because I used quite a few long lenses, a lot of the Canon ones and the Sigma ones, and I used cameras without in-body stabilization, only with the lens stabilization. And then now, obviously, I'm shooting with the R5, which has IBIS. My experience is that I shot the moon hand-killed at 1,000 millimeters at 1/8 of a second, getting constantly sharp results only because of the way the camera performs. An overall rule of thumb is, how you guys explained, try to be double the focal length. So on the shutter speed. So for example, if you're shooting at 200, you want to be on 1/400 of a second. Or if you have really steady hands, or if you're on a tripod, I think at the moment, like anything from 1 over 125 of a second or 1/160 of a second should give you a sharp result of the moon. But again, I think one important thing when you do that is try to shoot in a high-speed drive shooting that you have on your camera, which means that you hold down the shutter button and it takes a few photos, which will be taking, I believe, as many as your camera. So don't have the shutter speed too low, because it's going to slow down the process of shooting. But if you take like 4 or 5 photos and try to keep steady, usually 1 out of the 5 or 2 out of the 5 hopefully will be like really sharp, and you will be able to have a keeper instead of taking a single exposure. I mean, 1 single photo, 1 single click. Because obviously when you press the click, there's a lot of movement happening inside the camera. If you don't have a mirrorless, there's the mirror going on and everything. So, with the other way, I mean, you will get a sharp photo. One of them will be sharp. Of course, providing you have the right shutter speed for it.
That brings actually another question. And when the moon is really high in the sky, and sometimes and it's super dark, you have to take two exposures. You cannot overexpose the moon because you still need all that detail, but you don't want the foreground that is like super dark. And I am not the best at, I do some blending landscape, but for some reason, every time I try to do my blends with the moon, that's why I always try to shoot the day before. And they look Photoshopped to me, but I know you guys, Fabian, I've seen some of yours, and it's pretty good. Do you want to give us some tips how to properly like blend exposures? Do you use double exposure, or do you use multiple exposures? And do you process on Photoshop?
Well, first, thank you. But yes, no, I actually do a lot of blending, and one of the technique that I use the most in landscape photography is time blending, which is a bit more advanced, I would say, the HDR, but it's kind of the same. So the way I do my blending is taking several pictures at different exposures, and then go to Photoshop, align the images, because even if I shoot on a tripod, maybe it's windy, so they are maybe 1 pixel off between all of them. And so I go to Photoshop, edit, align layers, and so I align all of them. And then I start using, well, now it's going to get complicated. I start using luminosity masks to select only the brightness part or the shadows of the image, and then tweak all the necessary bits and bobs of every single piece. Mainly, I think the lowest amount of images that I use when I do my blending is 3, but I can do up to 20, I think. And I've done also stacking when I was shooting the moon by itself, for example, to have even more details on the moon. So I would try to follow the movement of the moon for as long as possible, and then take several pictures along the way, and then stack them together in Photoshop to have the most amount of possible details.
Okay, so you just align them all in Photoshop, and then you manually pick some areas, right? You don't allow Photoshop to blend it automatically.
Yeah, when I do the blending, no, I do everything by myself. I don't trust any software or any camera or anything else. No, I only trust my eyes, my hands, and, well, my eyes not for much longer because I'm getting older, but that's what I'm trusting, yes.
Yeah. And what about one of the most important things about planning? Because that's for me is always 90% of the work is planning, and just hoping like the weather cooperates with us. I mean, for planning, I don't know if people in the audience are familiar with apps such as PhotoPills and the Photographer Ephemeris, and there's more apps as well that we use to plan in advance if we want to shoot the moon with a particular subject. Should we go over that?
Yeah, I think we should, and I will say the truth. So my best planning that I ever do shooting the moon is consulting Fabian. No apps can beat Fabian. 100%. We have this joke with Fabian that whenever he takes us to a location, we get a good shot, we need to give him a $5 because he's the one who's planning really good stuff and always has the best ideas. So I think I'll pass over to him to explain the planning process.
Yeah, you still owe me a lot of money, man.
I do. Yeah. I do. I could pay you Spanakopita, by the way.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I can. Yeah, okay. I'll be happy with that. Spanakopita all day. Okay, good. Yeah, planning. Like I said, the journey to me is much more important than the destination. So as much as I enjoy taking a good sunset, sunrise, moonset, moonrise, full moon, super moon, what really excites me is the planning. Because when I get the shot, then I feel complete, and I don't need to shoot that anymore. But the planning is really, really important. And what I use pretty much on a daily basis is PhotoPills that you, Mara, mentioned. It's not a free app, unfortunately. It's a paid app. I think it's now £9 on both iOS and Android. And it's not just about planning the moon position and the sun position. The app is very comprehensive. It does lots of things. You can plan star trails if that's something you're interested into, and it gives you all the information about setting the right exposures with an ND filter, etc., etc. So it's a very comprehensive app. But the way I use it is try to find the direction where the sun or the moon will be on one specific day. And so on Thursday, I will check where it is because it's the next supermoon. Although the weather is going to be crap, so I probably won't shoot anything. But ideally, I would look at the orientation, and from there I decide whether there is an interesting vantage point here in London where I can shoot towards that direction. And just by trials and error, I keep moving my position and the moon position at specific times to try to find where could be the best position, really. Takes quite a long time, and that's just on the app, because then of course there's the scouting time as well, because after I found the location, if it's a place that I don't know already, then I would need to go there maybe a couple of days in advance and see where the moon is, or if there are any construction works, if there are cranes, if there are buildings on the way, because you never know in London. One day you go there and then 2 months later there's a massive building that blocks the view. So that's always a problem here. And so I scout the place. Sometimes I scout the surroundings as well to see if there's maybe a better vantage point, although maybe it's a different angle, so there's a different alignment with some of the landmarks of London. But that's all the planning on the app and scouting on location, hours and hours and hours, and sometimes for nothing, because then clouds arrive and they mess up everything.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. So, I also suggest, that what we all do is that we chase moonrises and moonsets, because when the moon or the sun is closer to the horizon, there's a illusion that it's not bigger, but it will appear bigger to the human eye. So, but you can also photograph the moon when it's high in the sky. And that situation is better that, you go close to your object of interest. But when you're shooting a moonset and a moonrise, you want to be far away, the farthest away you can, depending on the lens that you have, to enlarge the moon as much as possible. So for that, you need to know where the moon is setting. Usually, on the west, the moon rises like the sun on the east and sets on the west. But you need to know in the city or where you live, where the side that is rising and that is setting, and you can find that with apps like PhotoPills or the photographer Ephemeris. And then it's usually, like Fabian said, like a clear area. You probably want to be as high as possible with no obstructions in front of you, and as far away as possible as well. And we usually just don't show up there on the day. We usually check the spot, and check because the moonrise moves in terms of time, but also moons in terms of position. So every before the main event, we go there and we check if we have the right alignment, if we believe is actually going to happen from that spot. So there's a lot of planning, and like Fabian said, things like my favorite app has to be PhotoPills, because like you said, there's there's the Milky Way position, what time the Milky Way is rising or is in certain position for your photo, and also with the moon as well. And the good thing of PhotoPills and the moon, it will let you know how big the moon will look in comparison to your to your subject. And so that's very important, because it's just not showing up and say, oh, I know I found this alignment and I know the moon's going to rise, behind, the shard. And it does, but then you're going to get a really tiny moon and you're going to be super disappointed because this is not what you saw or you have in mind. And so it is important to do the math. The good thing is that the app does the math for you. You need to know how high your subject is, and it will let you know how enlarged the moon will look. So if you're interested in doing moonshots, I recommend you to be very familiar with the app PhotoPills and to your city or the local area you live, because we're always going on Google Maps and trying to find those sparks or those like areas that are that are a little bit far away from the city and completely clear around. And so I think that we spend a lot of time doing that.
Yeah, also since you mentioned the height of the buildings, actually PhotoPills gives you the height of the astro as well. So it tells you how high will be the moon or the sun on the position you set on the app. So that's really useful. Like say for example you want to align it here in London again with the Gherkin, and the Gherkin is 180 meters high, then you need to find a location where the moon will sort of be at the same height, or where the tip of the Gherkin will be in the center of the moon or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, not only how large the moon will look, compared to your subject, but also the how high it will look, and like the right time that the moon, for example, will touch your subject, for example, the top of the shard. So it's a very, very useful app. So in terms I think we all will recommend someone that is, trying to enter, moonscape photography to be very, get very used to the app, because it's extremely useful and it saves you a lot of time and lets you play around. Sometimes, your plans are not possible, but nonetheless, it's a very, very useful app. One thing that I have, I know both George and Fabian, you guys do time lapses. I don't. I'm more like still shot. I just have a shot in mind and I try to get it. Do you guys want to teach a little bit about time lapses? I'm curious how you guys deal with, light changes, because as the moon rises, depending on atmosphere, it can look really orangey or really red, and then it goes up in the sky, becomes more whitish and becomes yellow and then white, and even the city lights as well. How do you deal with those light changes?
I think Fabian is the best person to answer this, because I shoot time lapse literally just for fun. I don't shoot it professionally. I just do it because I think it's quite cool and fascinating to be able to look on video what happened, rather than just taking a still and say, yeah, it was there. Actually, it's really funny because sometimes I use it for proof, because people think, it's extremely rare I will add the moon to my photos. Like 99.9% of my photos are actually one shot. So sometimes I use it for proof for the non-believers. So Fabian, you can take it away with the time lapse.
Depends. So I use either a variable ND filter in front of the lens. That's true, especially for the sun. Or otherwise, I just play live with the dials on my camera, because I use a Fujifilm camera, and it's a very retro style camera. So all the dials are available at my fingers. I don't have to fiddle with the menus, because sometimes I'm not sure if you start shooting a time lapse, if you can actually go to the menu and change the setting on the fly. Also, it's probably better if you touch the camera the least amount possible, because it will shake everything. And so with the dials and the way that they are designed in the Fujifilm camera, they're very easy to use, and I don't move the camera too much when I use them. I can change the aperture or the ISO. I don't touch the shutter speed, but I can change the aperture or the ISO on the fly to correct the exposure, really. I have the exposure compensation level on screen all the time, and I try to keep that one consistent. So if it says that I start shooting with an exposure that is -1, for example, so it's a one stop underexposed. I try to keep that as consistent as possible. That's not always possible, of course, and for any flickering or any adjustment, I use a software on my Mac which is called LR Timelapse, which can be a pretty expensive software. So there's a free version that you can use for up to 400 shots, and MP4 exporting only, so nothing too detailed like ProRes or too advanced like RAW files. But it's really the standard for time lapse these days. There are a few others, but they're not up to par with that one. And it's pretty detailed in everything that you can do with that one. It interfaces with Lightroom, so you basically import everything into LR Timelapse, so it does its own adjustments. It digests all the raw files and looks at the exposure, the difference into the exposure, into the colors and everything. Then it creates a few keyframes, and in Lightroom you then correct those keyframes, and then you go back to LR Timelapse and it creates a sort of smooth transitions between these keyframes that then eliminates the flickering, eliminates the differences in light. It's not always perfect, but it's a really, really, really good one. And especially if you don't do Holy Grail time lapse, which is the passing between night to day or day to night, which can be quite complicated. But if you don't do that, it's pretty easy and it does everything very effectively. If you do night to day or day to night, then it's a bit more complicated because there's a lot of changes happening during the time lapse. But LR time lapse is the software that can handle everything.
And for the audience, does anyone has a question? Does anyone wants to jump on stage?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mara.
Have a good night.
Wednesday, Thursday for the full moon.
Yeah, let's hope so, right?
Yeah. All right. Have a
Bye.
good day.
All the best, guys.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good night, guys. Bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.